Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Delivering Regional Cross-Border Infrastructure session at Infrastructure Africa. My name is Dwayne Newman. I'm a director at a company called Cova Advisory, and we've been operating since 2012 and been assisting companies with various infrastructure projects, mainly in South Africa, but more and more the questions are coming of what's happening around infrastructure in Africa. Today we have four esteemed panelists who will be joining us today to be assisting us to unpack around cross-border regional infrastructure projects and how they can help Africa unlock its value. So first up, we will have Tuwela Njirajera. Currently, Dr. Tuwela is the head of the Economic Integration Division at the African Union Development Agency. The division spearheads the flagship programs and implementation frameworks that advance regional integration in line with aspirations of the African Union's Agenda 2063. Welcome, Tuwela. Second up, we will have Peter van Dal. Peter is the CEO of the NEPAD Business Foundation and has been there since as the CEO since September 2018. And in his previous capacity as a program manager for the Africa Infrastructure Desk. So Peter has had many conversations around infrastructure in Africa. Welcome, Peter.
Thanks, Dwayne. Great to be here.
Thirdly, we've got Jean-Marc Kalola. Jean-Marc is an economist by training at the ESRO-CA in Cameroon. And before joining the ECA, Jean-Marc worked in Switzerland and Kenya. And I know currently he's based in Brussels. So he's got a lot of experience in analyzing the economics around infrastructure. So welcome, Jean-Marc.
Thank you, Dwayne.
Okay. And finally, but not least, we've got Niels van Niekerk, who is currently the Chief Executive Officer of the Steel Fabricators of South Africa. And this industry association has obviously got a key role to play on the African and South African continent. And yeah, Niels has been has had a 50-year career, been in steel, industrial manufacturing and steel construction locally and abroad. Welcome, Niels.
Good day to everyone.
Okay, so today, I think the main focus is talking about regional cross-border infrastructure projects. There's been many recent discussions around the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Lots of discussions around the intra-regional trade in Africa is only sitting at 13% of total trade in Africa. And that number is much lower than other regions around the world. When we start looking at jurisdictions like the EU, where 60% of their trade is intra-regionally, North America is about 40%, and the Asian countries is sitting at 30%. So we can clearly see that Africa region doesn't really trade enough with itself. One of the main reasons put forward for some of this is Africa doesn't do enough manufacturing and processing. But one of the other big reasons is our infrastructure good enough to be able to move goods cross-border. So there has been, I think, a lot of discussion coming out of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. We can have all the aspirations to reduce duties over 5, 10, 15 years. But do we have the infrastructure to support this bold ambition of getting many Africans out of poverty and stimulating intra-regional trade? So the first question I'd like to pose today is to Tuwela. Can you please contextualize the cross-border infrastructure complexities that you have seen on your journey to date.
Okay, thank you very much, Dwayne, and good afternoon to the panelists and the participants as well. So I think it's good that we are situating this discussion in terms of the AFCFTA, because I think we strongly believe that infrastructure will be the backbone in terms of the full realization of the benefits of the CFTA. And in that perspective, I think what you will notice is that the current conversations around infrastructure development in Africa are really looking at this issue of corridors and looking at issues of trade corridors, and really how do we make sure that we achieve regional integration by the effective usage of the corridors. I will come to the complexities and the challenges, but allow me just maybe to talk a little bit about this issue of corridor development, specifically in the context of PIDA, which is the Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa. And taking note that we are now going into the second phase of the PIDA Priority Action Plan, which is being implemented from 2021 to 2030. And what's important to notice about the PIDA PAP2 process is that there was a deliberate effort in terms of the prioritization and the selection and identification of projects. And what we did was we specifically looked at a concept which we named the integrated corridor approach. And what that did was to look very specifically at how do we deliver infrastructure projects in a way that is multi-sectorial. So we're looking at delivering projects across the 4 sectors of ICT, water, transport, and energy, and really trying to maximize the benefits that come with delivering infrastructure projects in an integrated manner, but also looking at the benefits of that infrastructure in terms of, for instance, rural-urban connectivity, in terms of being able to stimulate industrialization and support regional value chains. Having said that, and going now to your question about the complexities, clearly when we talk about cross-border projects, we're talking about projects that involve a multiplicity of actors, that involve more than one country, that therefore perhaps are difficult in terms of coming up with proper implementation arrangements that will meet the needs of everybody, achieve the ambitions of regional integration while respecting national sovereignty. So we find that a lot of work has to be done in the early stages in terms of getting the governance structures, in terms of getting the project structures well defined from the very beginning. But also then looking at the financing of the early stage project preparation. A lot of times what you hear is that financiers will tell us that the money is there, but they just don't know where the projects are, or the projects are not bankable, or the projects are not well prepared. So a lot of effort also has to be put into that early stage project preparation work. And that's really where AUD and NEPAD has actually taken a view that that's where we add value in terms of really supporting project sponsors, project owners, member states to develop and prepare these projects well from the very beginning so that they can actually be bankable.
Thanks very much, Tuwela. So, I mean, Peter, in terms of your specific focus at NEPAD, I mean, what has NEPAD been doing in this cross-border infrastructure space recently, and where do you think it's going to be going forward?
Yeah, thanks, Jane. Just to first of all just acknowledge that the NEPAD Business Foundation was formed in order to mobilize private sector support to the outer NEPAD goals and objectives. So what I'm about to share with you obviously will not differ hugely from Dr. Jerry, but perhaps what I'll just try to do is focus a little bit on a project level, perhaps, on some of the stuff that we've been working on. Mm-hmm. So within that framework, I mean, again, just to acknowledge the importance of the free trade area and the key enablers being regional infrastructure, regional value chains, and the identification and resolving of trade barriers. Those are the real sort of key elements that need to be done or sort of achieved in order for the free trade area to be successful. So within that space, what are we doing? Again, just to go back to, we focus on what the NEPAD agency under NEPAD is busy with. We take a focus primarily on SADC interventions, and I guess the best experience has been on the North-South corridor, which has been from South Africa through to DRC, spans 6 countries. So obviously very complex, but a high volume and high value economic corridor. So within that context, what do we try to do? We're working on rail development, rail infrastructure development. We're working on corridor management structures, to try and identify efficiency improvements that can be made. And then we also focus on trade barriers through a vehicle called the SADC Business Council that we host. Again, just to echo what Dr. Jerry said, the importance of a corridor approach. I think this is absolutely critical. And the whole concept that collectively you need to be aware of, what are your infrastructure issues, what are your trade issues, but anchored behind key customers and key clients. And that's where I guess the regional value chains come in. And in this case, we typically focus on the minerals value chains, agricultural value chains, and the FMCG value chains that move up and down this corridor. Again, I guess it will echo a lot of what Dr. Jerry said. Project selection is key. Perhaps our little nuance on that is the importance of involving the private sector in selecting projects. It's, I guess, what you could refer to as your best first case of assessing the business case of an infrastructure project, is testing whether it's something that aligns with private sector needs, and ultimately that's something that they would be prepared to pay a tariff for. And the importance of project champions and sponsors. Again, cross-border projects are complex. They involve multiple countries, multiple jurisdictions, can be very complex. So in our case, on the North-South Corridor, we've been involved as a neutral facilitator, program manager on behalf of the multiple countries and rail operators. So I think just the importance of getting that alignment and getting somebody that's in for a long-term play that wants to partner with the various individual sponsors. Within that space, again, legal frameworks. I think it's always been acknowledged the importance of having frameworks that allow different countries to work together on specific initiatives. But the danger is that you can make it overly complex. Dr. Jerry mentioned to the early stage, it can take years and years to negotiate an institutional framework without even having considered the merits of the project that you're going to be considering. So I think if you're able to find a fit for purpose vehicle to proceed in the short term, and also means in the long term you're able to design a proper institutional framework that does make sense for the ultimate solution. Project preparation is key. Again, Dr. Jerry mentioned their role that they're playing in terms of early stage project development. We also believe that there's lots of project preparation financing available. The gap is in that early stage work. It's required to do concept notes, pre-feasibility studies that can inform applications to the major project preparation funds. And I guess our work has demonstrated that this is possible with support having come from the Development Bank of South Africa, through the SADC PPDF fund, as well as from the World Bank subsequently. And then I guess execution is key, and it starts from the beginning. In the case of the North-South Corridor, having an agreement between the respective rail operators, in this case, to buy into the implementation of the findings of the work that they're doing is critical. So having that political alignment to execute from the beginning is key. Just to come back to the need for a corridor approach, why do we think it's so important? You need information to inform decision making. So a corridor is made up of complex of infrastructure to soft infrastructure, including border posts and systems, custom systems, to trade barriers. And effectively, what you're trying to achieve is, from a corridor approach, is to identify what is the best bang for buck in terms of improvements to bring down the cost at the time of trade, which is the main issue in terms of infrastructure. The more you can keep your fleets moving, the more you're able to bring down the cost of trade. So that's a primary target, and you need information across the corridor to be able to identify that. And then as you, I guess, so in that space, most of it relates to borders and soft infrastructure. As you progress, then obviously once you've sorted out your customs issues, you then look into infrastructure bottlenecks, which will probably be your more cost intensive, but secondary improvement. And then non-tariff barriers are things that happen all the time. So these are opportunities to resolve on a day-to-day basis. So I'll probably just stop there, just to note again the importance of looking at the anchor customers, the regional value chains that will be using using these systems, these economic corridors, as the people that should be informing, where should you be applying your effort and your attention. Thanks, Dwayne.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Peter, for that response. Moving to Jean-Marc, in terms of your specific expertise, obviously as an economist, what do you see the role of infrastructure in opening up Africa, especially as we're talking about this African Continental Free Trade Agreement, in terms of the work that you've been doing? Give us some insight into that, Jean-Marc.
Thank you very much, Dwayne, for the question, and hi to all the participants and panelists. Infrastructure play an instrumental role in harnessing the benefit of the EFCFTA, which is, of course, the largest trade agreement on earth. EFCFTA is about 1.2 billion people, a GDP of approximately 2,500 billion USD, which is supposed to double by 2050. And in order to harness fully the potential of this space, having sound infrastructure is very important. And in terms of what ECA, the Economic Commission of Africa, does to supporting member states, we support them first with our capacity framing the AFCFTA strategy. We assist them into that, and we also support them with additional studies. Let me illustrate the case of Cameroon. So we teamed with Trade Advisory Service in South Africa to come up with a study about the potential of the EFCFTA market for Cameroon. And we found out, we came up with a very interesting finding, which I can sum into a sentence. Your neighboring country is not necessarily the most, let's say, valuable trading partner. So your neighboring country, in other words, can be remotely when it comes to trading. And we found that in the specific case of Cameroon with DRC. So DRC seems to be one of the least interesting trading partner in a Cameroonian perspective, though it's nearby. Why that? Because you miss logistics. Trade between Cameroon and DRC can take, in terms of logistics, can cost you as much as trading with an Asian partner. So this shows the importance of infrastructure. So, if Cameroon or any other African country want to trade, you have to make sure that there is connectivity when you build your infrastructure, that you can connect with the other country. So we must think, as Toela said, at an African or regional perspective, how do we develop our infrastructure to ease trade between us? So in a Cameroonian perspective, DRC is a market with 80 million people. So Cameroon, for instance, developed its industrial master plan and intend to be the food provider for Africa. And I mean, everybody needs food, but you cannot access, if you don't have infrastructures, then you cannot really sell. So this, I think, show sufficiently enough how infrastructure are critical. And for Africa to really develop its potential to develop value chains, I think as Peter mentioned, it's key that we have very good infrastructure. And the challenge is, how do we finance them? I think I'll stop here for now. Thank you.
Thanks, Jean-Marc. Niels, so far we've got, I suppose we had a big picture view, what some of the challenges are, some of the solutions, obviously this corridor approach. Obviously from your specific perspective, it gets really practical, okay, around, in terms of your industry association, is obviously assisting companies, obviously get the rubber on the road, okay, or the concrete on the road. Maybe you can just give us an example of this, how this Kazungula bridge just take us through that project and how that helped South African exporters and I suppose other exporters in the region benefit. How that infrastructure project was key in terms of the corridor. Have you got some insights into that project, Niels? Thank you.
Well, thanks, Dwayne. Firstly, being from a technical background, we talk easier about physical things. And now you'll see from this slide, what a magnificent picture. Looking at the Kazungulu newly opened bridge from the Zambian side, it makes us proud as Africans. But interestingly enough, we can't miss the curved nature of the bridge. And when we look to the left of the bridge, we see there seems to be a shorter route that the ferries use. And it's quite interesting. Why is that? Now, I can tell you, being my age, that as a kid, I remember that the South African and Rhodesian governments of those days blocked the bridge that was planned already then. So now here we are, more than 50 years later, and we can celebrate that at last this happened. It didn't come easy. So here you see the map showing the borders. There's 4 countries coming together at that point. And the direct route would take it to the tip of the Zimbabwean part of the river. Because the Zimbabwean leader didn't want to take part when this project was started. They had to go, couldn't cross. And Namibia was as friendly as to agree to move their borderline. There was a physical change in the border. And you can now see from this map that yes, now Zambia and Botswana have a borderline. So yes, firstly then, congratulations to Zambia and Botswana. Thanks to Namibia for your willingness to change your border. We know your route doesn't go through there. To Zambia it goes through Katimamililo, and to Zimbabwe it goes through the Maun route. So yes, this Kazungulu bridge route is a bit longer. But it's an alternative to the Beit Bridge. And very interestingly, our guys use mostly the Beit Bridge because trying to avoid the ferry where there's often used to be problems. But quite interesting, we now see the Zim reaction to this bridge being constructed. They're now going to upgrade again the Beit Bridge to Chirundu corridor. And we know that the Lobito Copperbelt rail, when that comes in, that's going to be more competition for us, even from South Africa and from as a transport route. And so will be the new Uganda-DRC relationship that will give the DRC better access to the Indian Ocean. Now, isn't that great? That is how it should be. Competition makes people and countries great, not protection. I think that's very important for us all to understand. So that's why we must really celebrate this magnificent bridge. But then I want to come to another aspect of it. Wouldn't it have been much more spectacular if at the opening they could list all the African content in that bridge, or what went into it? How much of the steel from the Zambian Kafue steelworks went into it? How many local skills, etc., etc. So how much permanent industrial capacity was created due to this project? I'm not criticizing Botswana and Zambia at all. No, definitely not. We know that the financiers, in this case, Japan and the African Development Bank, with whom we are very thankful for financing this project, we know that they prefer the world-based bidding practices. And we understand fully why. It's due to getting the best price, firstly, and secondly, to ensure that the contracts run straight and without any corruption or anything else. But could we have built the bridge at the same price in Africa? I doubt it. But we know that from studies we've done that through the multiplier concept, that in our part of the world, a project can be 30% more expensive to a government if they use a total local project, and it will still be neutral to the fiscus due to all the taxes, etc., being gathered, whether it's personal income tax, etc., etc. So that multiplier effect must be taken into account. But before we're going to be able to convince our financiers to allow local preferences and higher prices, we will have to get our act in order and ensure them that it's going to be straightforward project, no corruption, no fronting, no whatever. So yes, I would it will be great when we see the next cross-border project, whether it be a pipeline, electricity interconnect, the next bridge. Wouldn't it be great to see that project as a prime objective was how was the African content maximized within that project? Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks, Niels. I mean, I think the reality is, I mean, as we're hearing so far around, I mean, cross-border infrastructure projects are complex. Okay, there's many stakeholders involved. Financing is not easy. Okay, where's the financing coming from? The guys who give the finance have got their own, I suppose, country objectives in making sure that the entities in their country, I suppose, get preference if they're going to be financing it. So maybe my next question is back to yourself, Tuel, in terms of African Union. I mean, is there a focus on increasing localization in these regional infrastructure projects? And I mean, how can the African Union, I suppose, assist in driving, I suppose, the capacity building and the localization, using local people, using local steel, local cement? Is that something on your radar?
Definitely it is. And thank you, Niels, really for highlighting that particular aspect. So within the AUDA, we have developed a tool which we call the Job Creation Toolkit. And what that does is that it helps us to shine a jobs lens on infrastructure projects across the continent. It allows us to estimate the jobs potential of infrastructure projects by looking at the benefits both in terms of the direct and indirect labor, but also in terms of the secondary and spillover effects. Beyond that, the Job Creation Toolkit also allows us to deal with the very problem that Niels is talking about of how do we maximize the local content and how do we make sure that we're able to provide opportunities to local industries to participate in cross-border infrastructure projects. And how we do that is that the toolkit is actually able to run scenarios that look at different sourcing options for inputs and really help member states to understand what is required in terms of to maximize the local content in terms of the skills, so that they can actually plan and sort of say, well, we sort of have these skills, but maybe we don't have these skills. If this project is coming 5-10 years down the line, how do we better prepare for that? If this project is going to need so many tons of steel, so many tons of cement, and the countries involved themselves perhaps do not have that capacity at that particular moment in time, how do they plan for that? How do they help and support local industries to be able to then participate effectively in these cross-border projects? So it is definitely a very important point. It is one I think that the African Union and the AUDA take very seriously, because we understand that the only way that we will be able to derive benefit from the infrastructure projects beyond the connectivity, beyond facilitating trade, is also how we will develop our local industries and how we'll create employment opportunities for SMEs and for local actors as well. So definitely something that is being looked at. And I think what we would like to see is perhaps more engagement between ourselves and industry associations and private sector to better understand how do we actually use tools like the Job Creation Toolkit. How do we better understand the needs and the requirements that come from local actors, so that we can take these into account when we are actually planning and preparing these projects? And I think Peter was very correct to say that the engagement with private sector needs to start early on. So it's not an engagement that must come further downstream, but it must really come from the very beginning. The private sector must be a part of that process from the very beginning, so they understand the project, so they can anticipate the project needs, but so that we can also together see what is the best way of structuring the projects? Where will financing come from? Where will local financing play a part? Where do we need to go and look for international capital, etc.? So I think all very valid points, and I really like the example of Kazungula, which we also were involved with to a degree. And especially from the OSBP perspective as well. What I would want to mention perhaps in terms of just generally, I think as far as cross-border projects, is also the importance of championing at a very high level. So I did hear you, Niels, when you talked about the politics and some of the nuances in terms of, how the projects perhaps were delayed or perhaps could have done better maybe if there was some kind of high-level political championing. So within AED and NEPAD, we have actually created a mechanism which we call Presidential Infrastructure Champions Initiative. And what that does is that it helps us to link projects with our heads of states so that they can actually champion those projects and help those projects to navigate some of the bottlenecks that may exist in terms of implementation. The North-South corridor that Peter talked about is a good example of that. It is being championed by the presidency of South Africa. So currently President Ramaphosa is the one that is actually championing the North-South corridor under that initiative. Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Torella. I suppose, Peter, I mean, that probably leads us back to you, right, in terms of these champions. So we obviously have political champions, okay? So we're talking here about President Ramaphosa being a political champion for the North-South corridor. I mean, how do you see business and sort of NEPAD also being a champion and obviously having these key businesses, I suppose, driving these developments cross-border? I mean, how do you see business, I suppose, doing a better job in championing beyond the political level?
Yeah, thanks, Dwayne. So I think just to first of all note, the importance of political champions is massive. So I think the example cited by Dr. Jerry earlier of the South African president championing the North-South corridor is critical. But it's also critical that everybody else comes on board and follows the lead. So that's very much the role of the outer NEPAD to see how they can support in that space. From a private sector perspective, obviously you have great expertise and know-how from having done these projects in their own lifetime. And aside from that, the champions that we like to refer to are the ones that actually have derived huge benefit from projects being executed, not as construction companies or suppliers, but as users. Okay. And we really like to get involved to the extent possible. People that have made investments in Africa somewhere along the North-South corridor that require efficient logistics to maximize the investment to get involved, because whilst they don't have a direct investment in or direct benefit from the projects undertaken, they have a huge benefit from the outputs of these projects. So what we've seen from our mandate is that there are champions that are prepared to support these projects, particularly in the facilitation, program management, project management side of things, in terms of coordinating the various people that are supporting projects, from the DFIs, the donors, to the governments themselves. And there's huge opportunity in this collaborative approach to executing on projects. Maybe if I can just quickly touch on the local content side of things as well, and Dr. Jerry mentioned the job creation toolkit. And we have also done some work in Tanzania around local economic development. And our view is that it needs a change of typical project approach, where you start to consider these goals from an early stage, in your pre-feasibility studies, in your feasibility studies. Because typically what we find that these are afterthoughts at a contracting stage, and that's actually too late to start considering these things. So start considering what you're trying to achieve from a very early stage, so that you can consider that, and what does it cost, what does it mean, and also the importance of specialist knowledge. So in the PPP sector, you have these PPP units in country. There's opportunity to have LED units in country that are centers of excellence for project sponsors to approach on these types of issues. So thanks for that. And also, I did take on board something you said that I hadn't thought of before, which is the tax implications, to make them a little bit more neutral. So that's something we will certainly put into our thinking going forward. Thanks, Dwayne.
Oh, thanks, Peter. I think I've seen it in many projects when there's government support coming into these large projects. You do need to think about the government support, how much it's costing, but also what revenue is coming out of these. Also there is a big drive at OECD level around, I suppose, taxation. Digital taxation seems to be the flavor of the month these days. But the reality is there's still big issues around where these projects get taxed. So, and who's going to be getting the tax from these cross-border projects? I think taxation and revenues to countries is a really important thing to consider in the early stage. Jean-Marc, in terms of the work you're doing, in terms of these cross-border projects and the economic benefit that you've seen and you've modeled in the work you're doing. Is there any advice you can give to policymakers on how to improve the economic benefit from these cross-border projects?
What we have done here in ECA sub-regional office for Central Africa, we have not so far touched this aspect. What we have done so far has been to devise some regional projects to really try to steer the interest of different government and also regional economic communities as to the interest of thinking regional, and so that they can understand and realize the benefit of working together. And talking about the corridors, here in Central Africa, the initial concept of corridor was to link major capital cities, urban agglomeration, and we moved from this perspective to really trying to link economic regions, because it doesn't make sense to link, for instance, Yaoundé with N'Djamena, Yaoundé being the capital city of Cameroon, with N'Djamena, the capital city of Chad, when business may take place between Douala, and which is the economic, the more the economic center of Cameroon, with N'Djamena, for instance. So we had to rethink all that, saying that, okay, this should not be a political move, but an economic move for it to have to make sense. So those are what we are dealing with right now.
Thanks, Jean-Marc. I mean, Niels, I suppose you, again, putting back to the practical issues, and I suppose you have challenged us all about local content. If you had to do this Kazangula project again, what's the capacity in Africa to be able to deliver on such a project as we sit here today? And maybe where do you think are the areas that we could improve on? Because I suppose it's one thing saying that we must have local content objectives, but these are really large projects, and I suppose it's really important to have local capabilities. The last thing we want is let's build it locally with inferior materials, inferior I suppose workmanship, so then the bridge falls down. Maybe give some of your insights into. Do we think SADC or the Africa region could deliver on such a project today?
Yes, maybe if you can just display the third slide that I've had. Yes, thanks. You'll see there the picture of the Burj Al Arab Hotel. 25 years ago, we built it, and today they claim it's the most photographed structure in the world. Now, how did that happen? Well, firstly, because a small number of companies in South Africa came together, realized they can't compete with the big companies overseas, and they decided we're going to tackle work outside South Africa, and we're going to tackle it outside Africa. And here was a project where a specific owner of a proposed hotel wanted a specific structure, but the European steel designers could not make it work. It said that structure cannot work. And that original ISF took on the challenge, and a designer designed it. It was later checked by the European designers that couldn't do it, and they had to agree it was possible. And yes, up went South African project. Even the carpets came out of South Africa. Really? Yes, of course, the companies worked together. They worked also with companies within the UAE, and the Malaysian company was also involved. Okay, you can drop the slide now. The key thing here is that we must firstly realize that we must stop trying to do everything on our own. That applies not only to companies, but that applies to countries. What we need today is call it a cross-border ISF, bodies, industry bodies that work and collaborate together over the border. It must not only be what can my country do, but what can we do as a unit. I can only agree with what the previous speakers also said about the localization. This can only be achieved right in the beginning, right when you begin to define the project, to talk about the project, involve the industry associations, ask them how can they do it, what can they deliver on, what not, how much can they grow by the time it's required, and how much will they need others in the region. And there's absolutely nothing wrong to use outside skills and outside product if you don't have it. I mean, how does South Africa industrialize? Not by the people in South Africa having the knowledge. No. As it was needed, companies were allowed to move into South Africa and to industrialize, but they had to stay here. They stayed here. And that's what I'm really trying to get at. Could we have built the Kazangulu Bridge? Yes, I'm quite convinced. Yes, we would have imported some stuff from overseas. We would have consulted with other designers. That's typical of these big projects. A local company could have designed the bridge and they would have checked it. In any case, with overseas expert designers. But the key is, as was said, right in the beginning, as Dr. Tuela said, right in the beginning, when you conceptualize a project, you will already have to start this collaboration. And our chambers of commerce, our governments, etc., are key to make sure that we have this inter-country sector relationships developed for projects. Thanks.
I mean, Niels, maybe just building on that, right? I mean, I think a lot of countries have got the local chambers of commerce, the local industry associations. I mean, South Africa's on a big drive around what we'd call master plans. Okay, and I'm sure a lot of other countries have got similar kind of initiatives. I mean, how do we start setting up these? So, is there a drive, say, in your sector, to set up an Africa or a cross-border steel fabrication industry association? Is there a drive? Is there seen to be a need for it? And do you see it happening in other sectors that can assist in this regional infrastructure drive?
Yes, we slowly are actually seeing members from other countries joining, and some of our own members also have operations in other countries. So that already helps. But it is not yet a key objectives of governments and chambers. That's the point I want to get to. Unless we get to that point where governments and chambers say we must work much closer together. It's not just a once a month gathering. It's actually what identify specific projects and then decide we're going to work on these projects and then chase the projects and see what can be done.
I mean, Peter, from your perspective and a business perspective, I mean, are you seeing a need for these sort of cross-border industry associations and cross-border business structures coming up to have collaboration that sort of Niels is talking about? Because, I mean, you can see more of that. Be more success in Africa-built infrastructure projects, right? Maybe some of your insights on that, what NEPAD's doing.
Absolutely. I mean, maybe not specifically having seen it from an infrastructure perspective, but from a trade perspective, we're seeing it. I think particularly in Southern Africa, we're probably a little bit behind the curve in terms of collaborating as business collectively on, defining what are the challenges and what are the opportunities to solve them. So you may or may not be aware the SADC Business Council was recently formed, and that's made some early moves towards trying to create those structures. They've formed their first trade barriers working group, which is in partnership with SADC Secretariat to start to identify and resolve these issues. As that matures, it's going to move into solutions mode. So, we mentioned the concept of corridors, talking about hard and soft infrastructure. Whilst these groups have been set up to tackle the soft infrastructure issues and some of the immediate opportunities, the longer term infrastructure opportunities will be identified, and I guess the case will become available to start having these cross-border infrastructure practitioners, I guess is the word, discussions to see how they can, shape and frame how these projects are developed. So yes, I think it's still early days, but I think at this point, the key is information, market information, understanding what others are doing to create the opportunities for collaboration.
Thanks, Peter. Dr. Tuela, your view on this around setting, I suppose, African business councils, is that something on the radar? So these become, I suppose, business-driven initiatives. Some of your comments on this issue.
So I think we can't overstate, I think, the importance of having such associations, whether it's business councils, whether it's the local industries, the manufacturing associations, etc. I think what I would also say, and I think Peter has raised a good example, for instance, in terms of the SADC Business Council and how that's emerging. And I think what we have to probably also recognize and acknowledge is the fact that we, at the moment, I think, we follow an approach of the regions as defined by the regional economic communities. So your SADC, your EAC, your ECOWAS, your ECAS. But at the same time, I think the ultimate objective is how do those regional bodies feed into the bigger continental architecture and the bigger continental priorities. So I think that will always remain the trajectory. And the question is always going to be, how do we do that faster? How do we do that quicker? How do we do that in a more efficient way of moving from the national to the regional to the continental perspective? So from our side as the AG and NEPAD, we started off with what we call the Continental Business Network, whose objective was really to try to see how do we create a platform for high-level engagement between private sector and government on issues around infrastructure development. Now, what I think will have to happen as this Continental Business Network, CBN, evolves, is that it now needs to start taking a bigger picture view in terms of who is private sector. A lot of times we tend to have the view of looking more at your financiers or looking at more of what I would call traditional private sector. And I think what we will have to now start thinking about is how do we bring in the business councils? How do we bring in the manufacturing associations? How do we bring in informal private sector? So I think that will have to be the thinking that will have to come into being if we are going to really actualize the gains of the CFTA. And I think the CFTA is causing us, I think, to think differently about regional integration, to think differently about the opportunities, and to really ask ourselves some difficult questions about how are we really going to make this work for everybody. So I think a bit of a paradigm shift in terms of how we're looking at the regional versus the continental perspective. I think that bodies such as ourselves are there to create the spaces, to provide the facilitation between industry, government, academia, etc. But I think we have to have that mindset shift that sort of says, let us really be serious about regional integration. When we say regional integration, let's mean it, and let's walk that talk that actually allows us to achieve that. Thank you.
Thanks, Doctor. Jean-Marc, your comments on this discussion around the economic benefits of creating industry associations, maybe the kind of research that you think needs to be done to, I suppose, galvanize business and governments to get this to become a reality. Some of your comments on this issue.
Thank you, Dwayne. I think it's instrumental. It's very important to have those cross-border association, cooperation, in particular when we have in mind the embryonic nature of industries, construction industries in many of the African countries. And when I listen to Niels or Peter, I see that, well, things are well structured, for instance, in South Africa, but this is not the case of, let's say, the majority of African countries. So creating that networking can serve to really densify and build capacity in the other countries. And this may also facilitate, in the context of AFCFTA, the coming in of South African expertise in other countries. And Niels also mentioned this, that it's not always advisable to use local expertise because it might be more expensive. He mentioned 30%, also in the context of corruption, governance weakness, etc. So bridging companies from, let's say, from abroad in a national perspective can really capacitate local industry. So I think this is welcome in that very aspect. Thank you.
Thanks, Jean-Marc. I mean, one of the biggest challenges in terms of any kind of cross-border project is the complexities with financing them. I think we've touched on, I suppose, the early stage finance where you need some kind of feasibility study or pre-feasibility study finance to get projects going. I mean, what are the challenges that we're starting to see in terms of actual financing them through, I suppose, the multilateral agencies and even some of the local banks and international banks? Maybe, Peter, some of your insights in terms of, I suppose, financing and the challenges that you're seeing that, I suppose, are coming to you as NEPAD around getting these projects off the ground from a financing perspective. Are they easy to finance when they're well prepared and stuff? But is it just the early stage that's the problem? Or are we seeing, is there a lack of funding for these type of projects in Africa?
I think we know all the answer to the question in many ways. I mean, it is extremely complex, extremely difficult. You know, what are we trying to do differently? I mentioned to you earlier is to start with the end user in mind as an early tested business case, because, you know, the fiscuses, as we know, are tight. So if we're looking to do private investment, you've got to start to understand that there's a tariff to be paid by somebody, and they've got to want the project from the outset. So let's just say that that's a small thing we've tried to change in terms of project selection, what we focus on. When push comes to shove, it is extremely difficult. You know, the multi-country jurisdictions, the sovereignties of some of the organizations we work with, which is very strong, but there are solutions. So, you know, I think what you have to do from the outset is acknowledge where the constraints are and plan around that. Unfortunately, the reality is once you start looking at it, it leans towards privatization and these types of discussions, which may or may not be solutions for the national government. So, you know, as soon as possible, you need to understand what a potential solution is and see where they can be achieved or not. So we have seen that that's one way. The other way that we've seen is there are multiple parts to projects. You know, you've got the assets that run on roads, the locomotives that run in the tracks that have business cases, otherwise we wouldn't have logistics companies operating. And the part that never seems to work is the fixed infrastructure. You know, that's the expensive capital side. So, you know, bridging that gap between the two is what makes a project successful from an fixed infrastructure perspective. So, you know, that's why roads have toll roads. You know, it's a way to bring the user in to start paying. You know, he has to put that into his truck, and in the rail space is the same. How can you create independent, or open access, where you can have different guys running their trains through the system, and, you know, they can pay an access fee. You know, that's the way that you start to unlock your fixed infrastructure investment. So there are ways, but the reality is it needs commitment and political will to move in that direction, and I guess that's the real challenge.
Okay, I mean, I suppose back to you, Tuwela, in terms of privatization, tolls in certain jurisdictions seem to have become a swear word if you don't get it right up front. So, I mean, I think in the South African context, we can see the e-tolling of the roads in Gauteng has obviously become a big political, I suppose, hot potato. It's fixed, it's not fixed, but it shows you if you get these things wrong, okay, the privatization model, the funding model up front, it can create huge challenges for infrastructure projects. I mean, the AU and stuff, I mean, how are you guys thinking about this privatization model and user pays financing model in these cross-border infrastructure projects? Is that something that is sort of top of your agenda in terms of, I suppose, privatization, or is there still a big drive for them to be government-owned infrastructure projects?
So my short answer is going to be that every project is different. and you can't have a one size fits all approach to all the projects. So we have to look at all the projects and look at them on their own merits in terms of really what kind of structure will work for that project. Will a PPP structure work? And if it is a PPP, how could it be done effectively and efficiently? Should it be purely government backed or should it be purely private sector owned? So from our perspective, what we do is that as part of that early project preparation support, through the service delivery mechanism, we actually will analyze these projects and sort of look at them and try to sort of, in collaboration with the project sponsors, really determine what is the best way of actually approaching this project in terms of how it should be structured. A lot of times also what we find is that when we now start talking about PPP projects, and Peter has alluded to the fact that there's capacity issues as well. So we need to also deal with those capacity issues in terms of being able to properly structure and manage PPP projects, both from the private sector side as well as from the public side. But what I did want to maybe just throw in terms of this issue of financing and really how do we deal with the challenges of financing these cross-border projects, because they are big projects and they're not cheap. We have looked at the issue of domestic resources. How do we mobilize and leverage domestic resources to be able to fund these projects? So for instance, in NEPAD, we have what we call the 5% agenda. And the 5% agenda is really looking at how do we mobilize resources from pension funds, for instance, into these cross-border infrastructure projects. Currently, you find that while the pension funds have significant assets under management, they don't make that much investment into infrastructure projects, partly because infrastructure projects perhaps are not considered as an investable asset class for them, or there may be some legal and regulatory barriers that prevent them from investing in infrastructure projects, let alone cross-border infrastructure projects. So we are really looking at saying, how do we change that? How do we allow our pension funds to be able to invest in local cross-border and projects on the continent instead of making those investments outside the country, for instance? Another thing that we hear a lot is that you hear people saying that, well, infrastructure projects in Africa are very risky. And that risky perception, or that perception of risk, is what then prevents the investments into these projects. So we are also trying to demystify and really deal with that issue of the perception of risk by actually showing that their projects are really not as risky as they're perceived to be. But we're also looking at mechanisms that through which governments can provide guarantees, so as to give comfort to private sector for them to be able to invest in these projects. So we have what we call the Africa Infrastructure Guarantee Mechanism, which is really looking at how do we leverage mechanisms across the continent to be able to provide guarantees on these cross-border infrastructure projects. So I just thought I'd mention those two aspects in terms of the financing.
Thanks, Doctor. Niels, in terms of, your involvement in terms of financing of these kind of, I suppose, large infrastructure projects, what are the barriers you see in the finance space of financing really large infrastructure projects? Are you finding the individual private sector players are raising their own finance? What challenges are you seeing on the ground?
I think the biggest problem is in participation is where the funding is tied. Most of the agencies, the international agencies nowadays, don't support tied financing, but some private investors and some from the East, we often still see the tied finance or the trade. The finance is part of another closed trade agreement. So in that aspect, we have no choice. When we see a project, the first question we ask is who the financiers, and then we know already: do we walk away? Do we spend any time on it or not? We know immediately whether it's going to be available to us. I think if I may just mention something about risk, Dr. Tuelo mentioned risk, and I want to just mention a risk of another kind. It's very easy to be the hero at tender stage, and we don't often enough see the measurement at completion stage. Is South Africa always more expensive than the outside world? Most definitely not. Not when we finish a project. And South Africa has got the experience, for example, in mining. So we're still a country of choice to deliver projects, mining projects throughout Africa, because the mining houses know that at the end of the day, when they count the money, then they know where the best price came from. Similarly, we've seen major international companies operating in major projects in South Africa with a major disaster as far as the financing and the risk. And you can see that there's no guarantee as far as the risk is concerned, because you are using an outside of Africa organization. So I think that we must always keep in mind that within that risk profile, what is going to be the end cost, and not just simply what is the tender cost in the beginning of the project. I just would like to highlight that aspect.
Yeah, thanks, Niels. As we come into a close of our session, maybe Dr. Tuela, maybe you can just give us your, I suppose, final thoughts on this really complex issue, multi-stakeholder issue of obviously with I suppose the end objective of having really quality regional infrastructure. Maybe some of your last thoughts as we bring the session to a close.
Thank you very much. And I think it's been a very interesting discussion, and I think a lot of important points raised. I think from my perspective, really what we would like to highlight is the fact that the only way we will achieve the benefits of the CFTA is if we really walk the talk of regional integration. And that means that we have to do that at all levels. So whether we're talking about the planning stages, the feasibility stages, the implementation, construction, whatever it is, I think we have to make sure that we are walking that talk of regional integration. And really looking at the opportunities that are available across the different levels, whether you're talking about informal private sector, formal private sector, our local actors, local financing. We have to take every measure possible to make sure we maximize the benefits across the entire value chain. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tuela. Peter, your final comments as we bring the session to a close?
Yeah, just to endorse what Dr. Jerry said, and maybe just to build on it a little bit, just to say, what are the key components? It's regional cross-border infrastructure, it's regional value chains, and it's regional trade facilitation. So the importance that infrastructure is not just fixed infrastructure, it's part of a system, and you need to attack the system, not just the parts. So again, just to acknowledge that there are a number of corporates out there that are big users of infrastructure. Let's just make sure that they are embedded in this process, and like Dr. Jerry said earlier in the discussion, private sector is not just financiers and builders. The bigger part is actually the users, and I think that's maybe just a misconception. So again, we continue to work. We're here to support, and hopefully this time next year we can report some progress.
Thanks, Peter. Jean-Marc, your closing comments.
Thank you, Dwayne. I'll say that to harness the full potential of the EFCFTA, Africa needs infrastructure. And the issue is not an easy one, because most of the government experience financial constraints. So it's key, it's very instrumental to really enlarge the fiscal space. And there are ways to do so. And here in ECA, we are supporting country into harnessing, in particular Central African countries, the potential of their ecological services. Thanks to the natural resources endowments, I think of the Congo Basin in Central Africa, we are capturing carbon, and this is a service. There are ways we think of getting money for those services that can really broaden up those countries' fiscal space, and the money that they are getting should be that they will be getting should be at least a large portion of it dedicated to building infrastructures. It's important for development, for poverty alleviation, and for really getting to the AU agenda, the Africa that we want. Thank you.
Thanks, Jean-Marc. And Niels, finally, you got the last word. Your final comments on this really important topic.
Yes, as you could expect, I would say, firstly, maximize African content in Africa, but only where it makes sense and where it's appropriate. Secondly, use maximum assistance from outside Africa where it is appropriate and makes sense. Thank you.
All right, everybody. Really appreciate your time this afternoon on sharing your thoughts on regional Africa infrastructure projects. They are really complex, multi-stakeholders. You need buy-in from a continental level, a regional level, and even at a business level to make these things work. I'm sure the discussion is not over. And I think as we start implementing this African Continental Free Trade Agreement, I think there's a lot of political will behind it. And I think it'll start making these projects opening up and solving many of the problems that we are talking to today. Thanks for your time, and be safe.